The wind dragged dust across the Holloway ranch like it meant to sand the place down to bones. It slipped through the chinks in the cabin walls and stirred the fire into a restless glow. Thomas Holloway hadn't slept in near on 3 days. His boots thudded slow and heavy across the floorboards as he paced, stopping every few steps to look down at the small bundle near the hearth. His son lay wrapped in his late wife's wool shawl, the fabric still faintly smelling of lavender and smoke. The baby's cries had once been sharp and angry at the world. Now they were thin, weak, like a kitten lost in tall grass. 3 days ago, Thomas had stood on a hill behind the barn, had crushed to his chest while the preacher spoke words he couldn't hear. The earth had hit the pine box with a sound he would never forget. His wife had bled out, bringing their son into the world, her hand slipping from his before dawn. Now the boy was slipping too. Thomas had ridden hard for the doctor in Dry Creek, pushing his horse until it near collapsed. The doctor came, checked the child, and left with quiet eyes. "Without milk," he'd said, not meeting Thomas's gaze. "There's little chance. The cows were dry this winter. The Miller woman who'd been nursing took fever yesterday. There wasn't another soul within 50 miles who could help." The crying stopped. That was worse. Thomas dropped to his knees beside the hearth and lifted the baby carefully. The child felt too light, too fragile, like something not meant for this harsh land. "You stay with me," he whispered, his voice rough as gravel. "You hear me? You stay!" Outside, the sky was moonless and cold. Then came a knock at the door, not pounding, not desperate, just steady, certain. Thomas froze. His hand reached for the rifle leaning against the wall. Folks didn't visit at this hour, not without reason. The ranch sat close to land that had seen trouble before. Raids, retaliation, graves with no markers. The knock came again. He opened the door slowly, rifle angled low but ready. A woman stood in the dark, Apache, wrapped in a faded red shawl, braids falling straight down her chest. Her face was calm, carved with quiet strength. "I know the sound of a starving child," she said, her voice low and steady. "I have milk." The wind howled between them. Thomas hesitated, suspicion and desperation wrestling in his chest. "If you wait longer," she added, eyes steady on his, "he dies." The baby gave a faint, fragile whimper from inside. Thomas stepped aside, and she crossed into the light. The cabin felt smaller with her inside it, as if the air itself had shifted. Thomas closed the door against the wind, the latch clicking louder than it should have. He kept the rifle within reach, leaning it beside the table, though he wasn't sure anymore who he meant to protect himself from. The woman moved toward the fire without waiting for instruction. The glow caught in her dark eyes and lit the faint lines of grief carved into her face. Up close, she looked neither young nor old, just worn by life in ways Thomas understood too well. "My name is Nahimana," she said quietly. Thomas swallowed. "Thomas Holloway." He hovered near the hearth as she knelt and gently held out her hands for the child. For a second he hesitated. The boy was the last piece of his wife left in this world. Trust didn't come easy out here, not between strangers, and certainly not across the invisible line drawn by years of blood and rumor. Nahimana didn't rush him. She simply waited. Finally, Thomas placed the baby in her arms. She handled him with a confidence that startled Thomas. Supporting his head, she loosened her shawl and settled near the fire. The cabin fell silent except for the pop of sap in the logs. For a long moment, nothing happened. The baby's mouth searched weakly, his strength nearly spent. Thomas felt his chest tighten. "Come on, son," he murmured. Then the child latched. The sound was small, almost nothing, but to Thomas it was thunder rolling across dry land. A steady rhythm followed. Suck, swallow, suck, swallow. Color began creeping back into the boy's pale cheeks. Thomas turned away abruptly, dragging a hand down his face. He hadn't cried at the graveside, hadn't cried when the doctor left, but now his shoulders trembled. Behind him, Nahimana spoke softly. "He is hungry? That is good. Hunger means he still fights." Thomas cleared his throat. "You said you had a child." The rhythm faltered for just a breath. "I did," she answered. The winter sickness took him. The words hung heavy in the air. "I'm sorry," Thomas managed. She nodded once, eyes on the infant in her arms. Milk does not stop because the heart is broken. When the baby finished, she adjusted the blanket with care, brushing her thumb lightly across his tiny brow. He sighed, a stronger sound than any he'd made in days. Thomas stepped closer, looking down at his sleeping son. "Why help me?" he asked, the question raw and honest now. Nahimana met his gaze. "Because no child chooses the wars of men," she said, and for the first time since his wife's death, the cabin didn't feel like a tomb. By the second week, the Holloway ranch no longer looked like a place waiting to die. Smoke rose steady from the chimney each morning, and the thin wail of an infant had grown louder, stronger, full of stubborn life. Thomas noticed the change in the boy, first in his grip, tiny fingers, wrapping tight around his thumb, refusing to let go. Each day Nahimana fed him by the fire, patient and quiet, as if tending something sacred. But the valley noticed too. It started with long looks from passing riders, then whispers in Dry Creek when Thomas rode in for flour and salt. Conversations stopped when he stepped inside the general store. Eyes followed him like shadows. Curtis brought the tension straight to the ranch. Thomas was repairing a section of fence when Curtis rode up, reins snapping tight in his fist. "Heard you got company," Curtis said, not bothering with a greeting. Thomas kept hammering. "I do. Apache woman," Curtis spat into the dirt. "That true?" Thomas drove the nail in hard and straightened. "Her name's Nahimana." Curtis shifted in his saddle, uneasy. "You forget what happened to the Miller place. You forget the raids 2 winters back." "I forget nothing," Thomas replied evenly. Curtis's gaze flicked toward the cabin. Through the window, Nahimana could be seen rocking the baby, sunlight catching in her braids. "Folks ain't gonna like it," Curtis warned. "You keeping her here?" Thomas felt the weight of that truth settle heavy in his chest. This land had long memories and short forgiveness. "My boy's breathing," he said. "That's what I like." Curtis shook his head. "You're asking for trouble?" Maybe he was. That night trouble came. The crash of breaking glass split the quiet. Thomas lunged from his chair as a rock tore through the cabin window, scattering shards across the floor. The baby startled awake, crying hard. Nahimana stood swiftly, shielding the child against her chest. Thomas grabbed his rifle and burst outside. The yard lay empty beneath the moonlight, horses restless in the corral. Hoofbeats echoed faintly in the distance. Whoever had thrown it was already gone. When he returned inside, Nahimana's calm had returned. Though her hands trembled slightly, she rocked the baby until his cries softened. "You should not make enemies for me," she said quietly. Thomas looked at his son, alive and red-faced with fury at being disturbed. "He ain't alive because of enemies," Thomas replied. "He's alive because of you." The words lingered between them, heavier than the shattered glass at their feet. The riders came just after dawn, when the light was still pale and uncertain. Thomas saw them from the porch, 3 figures cutting across the frost-stiff pasture, rifles resting easy in their hands. He had been up since before sunrise, splitting kindling while the baby slept inside. The calm of the morning felt fragile now, like thin ice about to crack. He set the axe down and reached for his rifle. Nahimana stepped into the doorway behind him, the baby wrapped against her chest. She did not ask what was happening. She had already seen. The riders stopped a short distance from the porch. The lead man, Brody Kessler from downriver, removed his hat slowly. There was no respect in the gesture. "We heard you're harboring someone who don't belong," Brody called out. Thomas kept his voice level. "She belongs where she's needed." A tight smile flickered across Brody's face. "This valley's lost enough to her kind." Behind him, one of the other men shifted his rifle higher on his saddle. Thomas felt the weight of every lonely mile between his ranch and the next friendly door. He also felt the small, steady breathing of his son drifting from inside the house. Weeks ago, that breath had nearly stopped. "She saved my boy," Thomas said. "Fed him when no one else could." "That ain't our concern," Brody snapped. "Send her out. We'll see her back across the line." Nahimana stepped forward then, calm as still water. "I crossed no line," she said quietly. "I answered a cry." Brody's jaw tightened. "Last chance, Holloway." Thomas lifted his rifle, not aiming yet, but making clear he would. His heart pounded so hard he felt it in his teeth. Veer whispered that 3 guns beat 1, but something stronger held him steady. "No," he said. The word hung in the cold air. Hoofbeats approached from the east. Curtis rode up, slowing as he took in the scene. He dismounted without a word and came to stand beside Thomas. "That baby's alive because of her," Curtis muttered. "Ain't right to repay that with threats." The standoff stretched long enough for frost to melt under the rising sun. Brody studied the 2 men on the porch, then spat into the grass. This ain't finished. Maybe it wasn't. But the riders turned and rode away. Thomas lowered his rifle slowly. Behind him, his son stirred and let out a strong, impatient cry. Not from hunger, from life.